Hi and welcome to ScIQ. Now, the US is known as an incredible inventor. People here are extremely innovative, but it might not always be this way. There's huge problems facing the invention community, including a lack of government support and funding and regulation challenges. And this could mean that America is facing losing its winning position at the top of the invention table. So I've brought into the studio two incredible innovators to talk about the challenges facing American innovation and how we can keep our spot at #1. So with me is Kathrine Jin. She is the 1/3 of the team that invented an incredible technology called Highlight. She's part of the team at Columbia that developed it as part of the Ebola Grand Challenges contest, which you won. Congratulations. And she did all of this when she was how old?
20 years old.
20 years old. So clearly the rest of us not doing anything with our lives. And the technology is helping to solve the crisis, the Ebola crisis that had hit parts of Africa. So not only a great inventor, but also a great humanitarian. When he's not at the MLB, Keith Comito runs Lifespan.io, helping to crowdsource funding on longevity and solving age-related diseases, helping us all live longer and prosper. So thank you for joining us. Now, the two of you are both incredible advocates for innovation and invention. But from different sides, you literally have invented a technology, you're helping other people to fund their technology. What I found interesting about American innovation is we are leaders. The United States is leading innovation, but it hasn't always been that way. How come everyone can't be an innovator?
I guess I'll field it first. I would like to think that everybody, or a large amount of people, do have the passion to innovate, but other conditions sort of can stifle that, like economic pressures. You know, it's hard to want to take a risk to be an entrepreneur or start something new when you're trying to make ends meet or take care of your family. So personally, that's why I think ideas like, say, increased automation plus guaranteed minimum income, things like that might be an interesting way to go, because it can maybe free people up to take those chances and innovate.
Is that what drove you to create Lifespan.io?
Well, I'm personally crazy, which I'm sure you can sympathize with. You have to be somewhat crazy to go on your own and try to start a new business or a company, so there is that. But, you know, I like to take a positive view of other people, and I think if you talk to any person at length, they usually have some idea that they want to do, or if they had their druthers, you know, they'd want to do this thing. So I think the more that we can free people up to be able to follow those paths, the better.
Yeah. Now, Kathrine, is Keith crazy? Are you crazy?
I think maybe like 10, 20 years ago, be a lot crazier. But back when I was at Columbia, a lot of universities of the same caliber are trying to promote entrepreneurship and invention, which I think is great, and it's definitely a new step for a lot of universities. So in that, at Columbia, during the Ebola crisis, they held this Ebola Design Challenge hackathon where students would go, sit for 24 hours and try to figure out low-cost solutions for the worsening crisis. And that's actually how we got our start. And I think since then, Columbia has held yearly challenges. Now they hold venture competitions. And this all goes to say that having some kind of path for people to learn how to be innovators, and also giving them some structure, takes away a lot of the risk and a lot of fear of students who, you know, don't necessarily want to come out of college and take a big leap of faith, but at least gives them a controlled environment where they can learn a lot and kind of get their foot in the door and get some experience before they, you know, take that initial leap of faith once they graduate. So I think innovation itself has been, you know, a hallmark of the United States, and I think recently, you know, with all the success in like Silicon Valley, with apps, medical devices, you're really seeing a huge shift in universities as well in what they're promoting and what they expect from their students. So I think, you know, innovating now might still sometimes seem risky and scary, but I'm hoping, you know, within the next like 10, 20 years, it'll be just as viable the path when you graduate from college as any other job or any other graduate school.
Now, when you tell this story about the 24-hour hackathon, it sounds like you went into it, you had an idea, first time, worked out perfectly, didn't need to iterate. Yeah. What was the real story?
Yeah, obviously a huge simplification. So we went to the hackathon. They brought in healthcare workers and doctors who actually were in West Africa during the crisis. and they were telling us, the problems they were facing, and one of their problems was ineffective decontamination. So when you spray someone down after they've worked with an Ebola patient, they're wearing those big yellow PPE suits, personal protective equipment, and when you spray someone down with bleach, you can't really see where you're spraying, and bleach has a lot of bad side effects, like makes you cough blood, or it's super irritative to your respiratory system. So obviously, when I came to college, and at college, I was never personally passionate about disinfectants, but this kind of problem fell into our lap. Our first idea was, let's colorize it. So we went to the grocery store, bought some food coloring, and threw it in bleach, and that was our first proof of concept. And obviously, it's become a lot more complex since then. We learned a lot more about disinfectants, like disinfectants have a contact time, you need to have good coverage, and then we wanted to have something so that the color would fade when decontamination is complete. But
So you're not wearing blue suits instead of yellow suits at the
when you
end.
spray down a hospital bed, it's not blue forever. It's only blue when there might still be active pathogen on it. So that all goes to say it all started from this one moment where a problem we never heard of was presented to us by experts in the field and kind of gave us the impetus to start from there.
So in order to try and solve a problem, you got into a field that you'd never thought that you'd be in.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, a lot of my peers in college, of course, all have the dream of starting the next big thing, working for yourself, making a lot of money. It seems a lot more fun and also a lot more independent than maybe working for a company or going for grad school. But I think a lot of the problem there is you're looking for a cool thing to invent. And what I think was really great for our company, Kinos, was that a problem was presented to us. So we had something that we knew had to be fixed, as opposed to kind of going the opposite way of trying to make something cool and trying to fit it into the market. We were given a problem, told that there was a gap, and we're able to develop a technology that hopefully will close it.
Now for you, Keith, it's really interesting because you're working on life-extending technologies. So it sounds like the impetus for your innovation was that you wanted to live forever.
Yeah, that's always kind of the question that everyone asks you, the gotcha question, do you want to live forever, right? But it's actually a much broader issue. So it's kind of almost the opposite scenario where the issue is everywhere and no one really looks at it. So obviously we all go through aging, we all kind of understand the process. But there's not really a clear recognition that certain aspects of this are maybe not awesome. Like, nobody wants to get Alzheimer's disease, for example. But the government funding and also, other organizations, they don't really focus on the problem of aging. It's sort of, let's try to cure cancer, let's try to cure Alzheimer's or heart disease. But in a sense, if you're looking at it as a humanitarian goal of trying to alleviate these conditions or even protect the economy, because as people get older, there will be a big economic problem, which is happening in Japan right now. They call it the gray tsunami. It makes more sense to, say, work on helping the trunk of the tree instead of the branch of the branch. So for just economic reasons as well as personal, and ethical reasons, I think it's a societal good. But to answer the question directly, I don't want to dodge it. Yeah, I don't think there should be any shame in anyone who advocates for this to say, I currently love life. I love that my family loves life. I would like to continue that in perpetuity for everybody, or at least defer that decision to my future self. And I think you should be allowed to say that.
I often defer decisions to my future self. So I'm glad that you mentioned government funding, because America has a great history of innovation. We've invented everything from the internet to nuclear bombs, and those two technologies, the internet and nuclear weapons, both were invented in large part because of government funding, government support for innovation. You also hear the other side of in the US about, the lone frontiersman, and he pulls himself up by his bootstraps and does incredible things with no help from anyone. And that's kind of the image that a lot of people have of inventors. So what role does the government play in supporting people who want to innovate?
I think I can speak personally about it. Our technology was brought about in large part because of a grant we received from the US government. So when we first started inventing the product when we were juniors in college, we didn't really know that much, and we also only had $500 from this hackathon. So really working with a low amount of capital. And we had a proof of concept. We wrote up a grant application, applied to the USAID Fighting Ebola Grand Challenge, which was this large grant that was kind of set aside by the US government to look for solutions for the Ebola crisis. And we won, which was amazing. We were the only undergrad team to win, and that was super cool to not only receive a government grant, but we also received close to $1 million to complete the development of our product, field test it, and then, go into these countries where healthcare workers were battling Ebola and try and help them out. So we had not only the funding, but we also had the legitimacy that the U.S. government brings to backed businesses. So the other winners of the the Fighting Ebola Grant Challenge by USAID were companies like Nike or like the people that actually made those PPE suits, DuPont. So those were big companies, and when they go to an NGO or a low-cost setting, they can get in the door really easily. But imagine like 3 undergrads showing up at your door saying, we have this new technology. It's blue. I've never seen anything like this before. Like, please try it out. Obviously, probably wouldn't go over that well. But with the support of USAID and therefore the support of the US government, it was a lot easier to get our foot into the doors in a lot of these countries, and also gave us the backing to push the product through. And now we've raised a separate round of actual equity funding, but if it wasn't for the USAID Fighting Ebola Grand Challenge giving us that first amount of capital to get started, we definitely would not be working on this today. I think if we had gone to any VC or any angel at that time and been like, hey, we're working on a disinfectant for Ebola in low-cost settings, would have turned us away immediately. Not only because the product is niche, but because the problem itself seems so, I guess, not exactly the most lucrative problem to solve in the U.S.
It's not sexy.
Exactly, but given the time that we had under the incubation of the USAID grant, we were able to figure out that this product has applications in other places as well, not only in low-resource countries during epidemics, but also in U.S. hospitals with hospital-acquired infections. And we were able to really expand the product platform so that when we did go raise an equity round, we had a much stronger business plan, and we also had developed the technology completely. So I think we were really lucky to, have started this company at a time where the U.S. government was being very generous in divvying out grants for these, really important problems. And I think having that continued on the government level, yearly or like biannually would be really important to get innovators to focus on problems that aren't necessarily, as you said, the sexiest problems, but are just as important. HAIs affect millions of Americans. The U.S. healthcare system loses billions of dollars every year on HAIs, but hospital-acquired infections, once again, aren't necessarily the, big headline grabbers on the Washington Post every morning, but that doesn't mean the problem isn't any less important. So I think the role of government funding can really be to kind of create channels for inventors to target these problems that really impact a lot of people, but aren't necessarily like the most attention-grabbing when you're looking for equity funding.
Now, speaking of funding, your whole platform is about getting funding. Why doesn't the government just fund these life-extending technologies? You would think they'd be interested.
You'd like to think that, but kind of piggybacking off of that, it depends on the industry, right? So I'm sure, military spending is doing okay, but how about infrastructure innovation? How's the Long Island Railroad for anybody in the area doing these days? But I think it's important to realize the importance that what the government chooses to focus on really matters. So take NASA, for example. In some sense, when I was growing up, everybody wanted to be an astronaut. That was a mission that we all aspired to. Most of us didn't become astronauts, but I became a mathematician, a computer scientist, partly because of that. And when you see NASA get rolled back in the intervening time, it sends a message that we don't want to be pioneers anymore. Now, I still think we can, but I think it's important to realize that there is a maybe not as easily perceived value there besides just dollars and cents. I think even in dollars and cents downstream, but that's super important. And also the role of regulation, I think, is very important here and how it affects different industries. Like IT is pretty open, and there's been a lot of innovation in IT, but in certain areas in medicine, for example, not to call anyone out in particular, but the Bush stem cell restriction, that was a huge blow, and it could literally have cost millions of lives down the road. So these things matter. So I think it's very important that we build scientific reasoning into our policy making, and that's a key part of how we decide what, as a country or a world, we want to focus on and where it makes sense to open up the funding for things that are valuable, like what you're doing.
Now, Kathrine, before the show, you were talking about how you purposely designed your product so it wouldn't have to go through all of these. It wouldn't have to get FDA approval necessarily. Yeah. And that was very much in your mind, the regulations that you have to overcome. And there's a big challenge when you've got a great medicine, for example, but you have to go through all these different rounds, and each round of checking and testing costs a lot of money. What could be done to make regulations less burdensome on inventors, and what could be done to help fund going through those important processes?
Yeah, yeah. I think we both have a lot to say. This is obviously an important topic if you're in kind of the healthcare space and you're trying to invent something. Yeah, going through the EPA and going through the FDA are extremely burdensome, can take, multiple years, if not a decade, and can cost up to millions and millions of dollars. So if you're a company that's already invented a medical device, sunk in all this capital, it doesn't really mean anything until you can get it approved, and ideally, get it reimbursed on like Medicaid or Medicare. And in the United States, that process can take a really long time. And what's interesting is in other countries, they have kind of different processes. So in countries in Asia, you can kind of fast track, or in Europe, they have the CE, which is kind of their counterpart to the FDA, and they have tons of local offices. And what a lot of people do in Europe is kind of go from local office to local office to local office, waiting for one of them to approve it, and once they get it approved, it doesn't matter what all the other local offices said, they can move forward. So I'm not sure if that's what we should be aspiring to. I'm not saying reduce regulations, but what I am saying is that, when a company gets an SBIR grant from the US government, which is often the grants that are given out to companies that are doing cutting-edge research that would otherwise be unfundable by a VC just because the amount of risk they're taking, once they actually, have something invented or have a product that's ready for the market, you've already had all this vetting by the grant administrators over this entire period of the grant. I think having some kind of acknowledgement that starting all over again in the process when you try to go through a regulatory body only eats a very valuable time. When I was working in San Francisco for one summer in college, I was speaking with a lot of people who were working on medical devices there, and a lot of them were moving to countries in Europe, specifically like Germany, because they really fast-track your process through, especially if you received a government grant before. So instead of waiting that long amount of time or paying that really large amount of money, you can get your product through much faster. So I think having some kind of regulation that acknowledges there's been already a lot of due diligence in the process, often when you receive a government grant or when you work on these kinds of life-saving technologies, to kind of speed it up a little bit, as opposed to, starting all over again from square one and going through the regulatory body that way.
So for every regulation that's designed to protect people, there's a cost to that. So
Exactly.
slowing things down, and meaning that people might move to a much...
Yeah. If you look at innovation if you read, journals like Nature or Science, you see amazing, incredible work being done. When I read those journals, I feel so much faith and pride in the human existence and what my life will be in the future. But if you look at comparably what technologies are being used in hospitals, it lags by like 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. And there's a huge gap between the technology that's being developed that can really save lives and the ones that are actually saving lives right now. And I think, we need to close that gap. We need to get those a lot closer. I wish these, the life-saving technology that you often read about and hear about just could be quickly moved through the system, as opposed to me waiting 20 years from now to kind of get access to the stuff that I read.
Yeah. Is that a problem for the people that choose to fund their work through Lifespan.io? Are you funding invention, or are you funding innovation, or are you funding like development? What phase do people come to?
Yeah, very early, and absolutely very early stage biomedical research projects, because as was sort of alluded to, it really doesn't cost that much money to do a proof of concept. Where you get really, hammered is going through the FDA 1, 2, 3, phases, and it's like $6 million, or, and so that's typically called amongst investors the valley of death, right? So initiatives like Lifespan.io, we can help with that, because not only are we trying to get them the early stage research to prove their concept, it's also done in a very visible way that in turn can attract investors that we try to, hook them up with, and then maybe put them in front of some people in the government. So kind of bridging the pipeline all the way. So that's the role that we're trying to fill there, in addition to sort of just, getting the word out so people understand. But on sort of the government side, I wanted to make a comment about different countries, etc. So as mentioned, the FDA has this, very rigorous, I think it's actually 4 phases, but the 4th one is usually kind of like left out, or post-market to basically, when you have this drug, you're trying to get out into the public, you have to go through these very rigorous stages that prove, safety and efficacy, small sample size, larger sample size, etc. But when that becomes available to the public is different country to country. And I think you can make more sensible decisions on sort of a case-by-case basis, or allow people to opt in. Say you have a really bad condition, terminal. You should be able to say, yeah, I know this drug is experimental. It's not quite through the whole process yet, but safety has been sort of, sussed out. Let me sign the waiver. I mean, you could do that if you're going to go skydiving. You do that. You take a video and you say, yes, I'm aware that this could be risky. I'm going skydiving, right? So I think there's probably a way that we can make that a little bit more like some other countries that allow processes to be fast-tracked while still getting good data. So,
in addition to the cost in human life, when people can't access things that could potentially save their lives because they're stuck in regulation, there's also the cost to the US public. So if you want to do research on something, there's lots of grants, millions, billions of dollars in NSF and other grants available to you to do research. Once you have a technology, there's almost nothing as far as the government goes.
Yeah.
And so the US government is investing millions of dollars in developing technologies that are then being bought for cheap by foreign countries. So essentially, the US government is funding other countries to have great technology that was developed in the US, but is being marketed elsewhere.
I think you can see that best in like clean technology, solar panels or wind turbines or any of I think the most progressive stuff that's being done into clean technology. A lot of it was occurring in the U.S. and now a lot of it has been, not bought out, but, has a lot of Chinese investors. So Chinese investors are really, really, gung-ho on investing in clean technology. And it's a very risky thing to invest in the United States because government regulations or even policy doesn't necessarily line up with the idea that we need to develop some kind of alternatives to the way that we're living right now. And I think it's crazy, like in countries like the US where climate change is still a debated issue. So we can't even begin to address the problem of climate change because we're too busy discussing if it's legitimate or not, as opposed to other countries which have fully acknowledged it's an issue, and therefore investors, the government, everyone's on board to try and solve the problem as quickly as possible. And I think that's really terrifying to me because the idea is, this is where we lose, our status as the leader of the world, as the leader of the most innovative technologies coming out. We can't be an innovation leader if we don't acknowledge the problems that humanity is facing. And I think the best example of that is climate change.
So as long as the US believes that climate change is a Chinese hoax, China is laughing all the way to the bank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those are the technologies we're going to be implementing in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And if we don't develop them, they'll be developed other places or by, US companies that literally could not find the funding in the United States.
yeah, I'd just like to second that point. I think it's one of the most important issues that we have to talk about because not only is it kind of infuriating if you think about it, it has massive economic repercussions. That what the debate should be in the media, in politics, and everything is, okay, given this state of affairs of the world, how do we move forward? What's the right amount of, tax increase on oil or whatever, that now we're having a conversation, right? But to go like, oh, well, 98% of the researchers say this and 2% of the other researchers say this and they're funded by the oil companies. I mean, it could be anything. If you're not willing to, accurately see the world, how can you make effective policy? So I think it's super important now. It's a tricky problem to change, but I mean, 100%.
Yeah, I think it was like last winter, a congressman came in and threw a snowball in the chamber of Congress. And it was like, this proves global warming is a hoax because there's snow outside. And it's insane that these people are running our country, setting our policy goals, setting the agenda. How can we be surprised if we kind of lose the edge on upcoming technology when we have so many people refusing to acknowledge the current state of affairs?
I think there's also, I like to put some of the onus on us as well, the people and science communicators as well, to make sure that we are properly educating all of society, including legislatures, because to bring up the stem cell restriction again, I live in the city now, but I used to commute from Long Island and listen to C-SPAN on the radio every day and call in sometimes. I'm one of those guys.
Yeah, get in there.
Yeah.
Call your congressman,
Yeah.
everyone.
You can find a video of me, chewing out Congressman Barton about climate change from like 5 years ago. So go look for it. But I really feel that when I was listening to them talking about stem cells, I was shocked. But on the floor of the Senate or whatever, they were talking about it like it's like growing a baby in a vat and like killing it and like ripping its brain out and like harvesting its cells.
Yeah.
And they were basing their legislative decisions on that. And I was just like, whoa, like we got to do a better job here of educating people how this works.
Yeah, I mean, there's some parts of this country where parents can opt out their children for receiving a STEM education once they get to a certain age. Kids go to school, learn about, I guess, like climate change, and then come home and their parents tell them the opposite. So it's, I think, really important to have emphasized in like mandatory STEM education K through 12. When you're presented with the facts, it's hard to live in an alternative reality, and I think there are a lot of facts now that can be, universally agreed upon regardless of political party affiliation. And, with that, we could have finally the means to solve them.
Now, I could ask so many questions about STEM education, but we're talking about innovation, so I'm going to bring it back to that, as tempting as it is. With innovation in the US, it's not something that's talked about often. You don't see on the front page of the New York Times about how many technologies are going overseas, how many are dying in the labs, despite their enormous potential, just because of this funding gap. So what can be done I didn't even know about it until I started working with an innovation foundation. So how can we help educate the public about this problem? And why do you think people aren't thinking about innovation?
I think there just has to be more initiatives, like what we're doing here, and especially in the science world. I deal with a lot of researchers, and no fault of theirs. They don't really want to be doing this. They want to be in the lab. So a lot of them need PR help, I guess is the way to say it. This was a critique of, say, the Obama administration. That's the opposite scenario with, say, the Trump administration. Of there wasn't enough, like, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's some charts. Sorry. Here's some charts. To explain things in a very clear way. I want to use one example from aging as a clear example, because we get a lot of sort of knee-jerk responses. So this is just an example. When we talk about, say, living longer, living 150 years, you have a lot of knee-jerk, what about overpopulation? Well, what about being decrepit? Because when you hear, like, I want to be 150 years old, you think to yourself naturally, like, 100 years old, super decrepit, extended for 50 years. But it's very easy to, it takes maybe 2 minutes of some graphs and explaining that statistically that nightmare scenario is impossible. Because even if you were 95 years old and you froze aging completely, you're so frail at that point. You have such a high statistical chance of dying on any given year. You're going to fall and break your hip. You're going to get pneumonia. You cannot persist in that state. The only way that you can get significant life extension is through significant health extension. So that's just an example of, when you have a conversation, if people aren't, don't know the field, they think they're very strong in that assumption, like, oh, that means being decrepit. But it's like takes 2 minutes of the right YouTube video or whatever to explain that, and then everyone will sort of get on the same page. But that work has to be done. So that's what I mean. The onus is on us.
Having the wrong mental image, whether it's harvesting organs from babies or living as a 100-year-old for an extra 50 years. Did you ever face that with Ebola? You were dealing with a debilitating, horrific disease at a time when there was panic. Did you come into contact with people having the wrong ideas?
Oh, yeah, for sure. When we were in Liberia and Guinea, one of the most, I think, powerful moments of working with healthcare workers who are working during the Ebola crisis is a lot of them in their own communities had been ostracized. So they had, stepped up when the crisis was bad, put their lives on the line to protect the lives of others, but because of a lot of misinformation, because of their proximity to disease, a lot of them couldn't go home, live with their families anymore, talk to their friends, and that level of, I guess, misinformation really is harmful and so sad for people who have really put everything on the line, to protect their country. So I think kind of this misinformation problem is very clear, and I think you're right, scientists like us, like our peers, have the onus to get involved in these discussions and policy debates as well. I would love to see more scientists at town halls. I'd love to see more scientists, kind of take ownership over these facts and these theories and really present them in a way to people that aren't necessarily in their circles or in their peer-reviewed journals, but to the general public. That's why I think these are really important to kind of spread the information correctly and to people who really need to hear it.
With really good spokespeople, it helps. Now, I always ask this question when we talk about innovation. If you had $1 billion to spend on improving innovation, what would you do with that billion? In a lot of ways, $1 billion is not enough to fix the problems we're talking about. What would you do?
Well, I think, this is a tough question to field on the spot. But I think when you're looking at how to make the most effective change, and this goes for government or anything, you always want to turn the eyes inward on the process itself. So the answer, in my opinion, it wouldn't be, give $1 million to this company to build this technology. That's not the answer. It's, how can we create structures that bridge this pipeline to the earlier discussion, to set up, if we're talking government here, better government apparatus for how you can apply to get the right sort of funding, because there's a lot of holes in that process. When you're done with that, kind of like when you get out of college, like, what am I doing with my life? Same sort of thing, apparatuses that handhold and handshake through the valley of death. If America believes this technology is good, don't just fund the research and then leave China to pick it up. Not that there's anything wrong with China, but it has to be a full process. So I'm not sure if $1 billion is enough there, but we need to set up a end-to-end apparatus there to bring technologies to the world.
Yeah, I think that's a learning process a lot of government agencies are facing as well. When we first won the Fighting Ebola Grand Challenge, we couldn't use any of that money for business development. It was only for R&D. So we couldn't even file patents with it. We couldn't go to conferences. It was literally only for the research and development of the technology, which of course is helpful, but obviously when building a company, also very restrictive. So we were luckily still students at the time, so we're able to go around to a lot of competitions and pull together enough money to start submitting our patents and start doing more businessy aspects of running a company. But after the USAID Fighting Ebola Grand Challenge grant elapsed, USAID came back to us with the learnings they had from that grant period, and basically were like, we understand that giving you money for R&D isn't enough. So then afterwards, they helped us set up our manufacturing pipeline for our first product, the highlight sprays, and that was so incredibly helpful, not only because of the expertise, but also the capital investment, and that support to do something that's very difficult for any person, regardless if you're 3 undergrads or 20 years from now. People don't usually know a lot about chemical manufacturing. So having that kind of support in that very crucial gap between we have the technology, now what do we do now to get it out? Like, how do we even make it? So I think that awareness is slowly spreading. But yeah, if I had a lot of money, I would definitely invest in that kind of idea, having not only research grants, but also business grants for technologies. Like, it doesn't end when you figured out the technology. It ends when you've brought the product to market. And one last, I guess, addendum is I think it's so important to change the culture of invention. Just like you said, when you're growing up, NASA was like aspirational. Everyone wanted to be an astronaut. And now I think a lot of kids grow up and think, starting a tech company is aspirational, which is great. But sometimes it's like apps. And I'm not saying that apps are bad, but obviously we want the innovation to be focused on really important issues as well. So having challenges start from like elementary school, middle school, high school, or in college, where people can win prizes or kind of motivated or incentivized to develop things that they usually wouldn't even know about, would be so important in changing the culture of what innovation means in the United States.
It's always so impressive to me that people can name the founder of Facebook but can't name the founder of the internet that Facebook is on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the government funding helps and the publicity helps as well.
Yeah.
Now, if people want to follow your work and see where Highlight is being used and how the technology is being implemented and potentially support you, where can they find out more?
Yeah, they can find out more at kinnos.us. So Kinnos is the name of our company. It's spelled Kinnos. And we're also on like all major social media, like Twitter, Instagram. So if you just look up Kinnos, you'll find it.
They can tweet you.
Yeah. Tweet me.
Tweet you encouragement. And where can they find Lifespan?
Sure. Lifespan.io is the crowdfunding website that we've been talking about, and similarly on all social media, Lifespan.io is the name. And we also have a kind of informational website at leafscience.org, and that's just kind of articles about funding and research and all that. And if you really want to help us, you can be what we call a hero, a Lifespan hero at lifespan.io/hero. If if you want to get involved yourself. So help is much appreciated.
And visiting that website is doubly cool because not only do we get to see how you're helping improve innovation, but also all the new technologies that are coming out that are on your platform. So very cool.
Yeah, so you can see the previous projects if you go there and sort of sift through. There was some interesting cancer work, interesting work in changing how our mitochondria work. Very interesting if you like that sort of thing.
We have a few science nerds that watch the channel.
Just a few.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for coming in and talking about such an interesting and extremely important topic, which is US innovation. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having
Thanks
us.
for having us.
Hi everyone, I'm Jayde Lovell, resident science nerd on the Young Turks Network. You're watching ScIQ and we know you don't want to miss an episode, so please click the subscribe button down below.